Hello everyone, welcome to the Kines 293 lecture. Today we're going to continue on with our theme of the science behind human performance. And specifically, we're going to try to ask and answer the question, what are some of the ways in which science has attempted to improve human performance? In the last lecture, we looked at the pseudoscience behind this idea of toughness and the notion that exposing people to extreme conditions will somehow make them perform better or enhance their bodies in some way. And hopefully, we kind of analyzed how problematic that is and the implications of that. But today, we're going to look at some of the other ways, a lot of them much more benign, but some of them with similar effects. And we're going to also answer the question in the process of what can we blame for athletic progress? Maybe blame is not the word, but rather what can we credit for athletic process? Biology or society? Or in other words, is it the fact that people are changing and their biological makeup is improving and that's why we see constant progress in athletic feats? Or is it other societal, other cultural changes that we can credit for this?
The Olympic motto is Citius Altius Fortius, faster, higher, stronger, and athletes have fulfilled that motto rapidly. The winner of the 2012 Olympic Marathon ran 2 hours and 8 minutes. Had he been racing against the winner of the 1904 Olympic Marathon, he would have won by nearly an hour and a half. Now, we all have this feeling that we're somehow just getting better as a human race, inexorably progressing. But it's not like we've evolved into a new species in a century. So, what's going on here? I want to take a look at what's really behind this march of athletic progress. In 1936, Jesse Owens held the world record in the 100 meters. Had Jesse Owens been racing last year in the World Championships of the 100 meters, when Jamaican sprinter Usain Bolt finished, Owens would have still had 14 feet to go. That's a lot in sprinterland. To give you a sense of how much it is, I want to share with you a demonstration conceived by sports scientist Ross Tucker. Now, picture the stadium last year at the World Championships of the 100 meters. Thousands of fans waiting with bated breath to see Usain Bolt, the fastest man in history. Flashbulbs popping as the 9 fastest men in the world coil themselves into their blocks. And I want you to pretend that Jesse Owens is in that race. Now close your eyes for a second and picture the race. Bang! The gun goes off. An American sprinter jumps out to the front. Usain Bolt starts to catch him. Usain Bolt passes him, and as the runners come to the finish, you'll hear a beep as each man crosses the line. That's the entire finish of the race. You can open your eyes now. That first beep was Usain Bolt. That last beep was Jesse Owens. Listen to it again. When you think of it like that, it's not that big a difference, is it? And then consider that Usain Bolt started by propelling himself out of blocks, down a specially fabricated carpet, designed to allow him to travel as fast as humanly possible. Jesse Owens, on the other hand, ran on cinders, the ash from burnt wood, and that soft surface stole far more energy from his legs as he ran. Rather than blocks, Jesse Owens had a gardening trowel that he had to use to dig holes in the cinders to start from. Biomechanical analysis of the speed of Owens' joints shows that had he been running on the same surface as Bolt, he wouldn't have been 14 feet behind. He would have been within one stride. Rather than the last beep, Owens would have been the second beep. Listen to it again. That's the difference track surface technology has made, and it's done it throughout the running world.
So, in this lecture, we're going to analyze some of these knowledges and some of the reasons that Epstein in that video talks about for the progress of human athletic achievement, or at least the perception of progress. And so we're going to start by talking about some paradigms of human performance, then get into certain knowledges and practices behind the enhancement of athletic performance through science, and then we're going to talk about the implications and toll of this athletic progress. And first, as I like to do, we're going to start the story in ancient Greece. As we've talked about before, sport in ancient Greece was a theological ritual in which Athletes attempted to glorify the gods with their play, and in that their victories earned them compensation, as we've talked about. However, it was very much a culture in that, as Ricky Bobby said, if you weren't first, you're last. There was no glory or prizes for second place, so the only thing that mattered in Greek sport was winning.
In ancient Greece, the whole culture was a body culture, with its own elaborate rituals. Before exercise, the athlete would be washed, oiled, and scented. A pleasing body odor was regarded as a sign of divinity. The entire body would then be sprinkled with dust, as prescribed in the ancient texts.
The dust should be sprinkled on with a fluid motion of the wrist and with fingers spread apart, so that the dust becomes more like a cloud than a thunderburst, covering the entire body like a soft down.
Yellow dust was favored, since
it adds a glisten and is a delight to see on a well-proportioned body.
After exercise and before bathing, the athlete would scrape off the oil and the accumulated sweat, dirt, and blood with a bronze strigil. The scrapings from a young, healthy body were believed to have magical properties and were used as salves for inflammation and skin disease.
Athletes of the ancient world were formidable competitors. They could do things that we would be impressed with and perhaps even overawed by today.
So I showed that kind of weird video in order to prove that this will to enhance our performance in some way has been entrenched in sport for as long as it has existed. This idea that through certain rituals or tactics or methods that we can somehow unleash this athleticism or improve our capacity for athleticism has something that's always been part of humanity. And while a lot of their methods may seem anachronistic to us looking on as outsiders, what if outsiders looked at some of the things that we do for performance today? Such as cupping, like we all saw Michael Phelps in the Olympics with his cupped body, or ice baths that people use to recover, or even things such as compression technology, where we see Derrick Rose having compression all throughout his legs, and Russell Westbrook and a lot of athletes having these shooting sleeves that they seem to wear for no reason. A lot of people say that they don't do anything, they just look cool. With Westbrook, we know that it doesn't help with his shooting, but still, they're pretty ubiquitous within sport. Point being that if another culture or an outsider looked at this, they would see it in the same way that we see some of those rituals in ancient Greece. Nonetheless, the science of human performance was kind of an entrenched cultural practice within ancient Greece. There were prizes. Education on how to improve one's performance was a profitable endeavor, and as a result, a lot of people opened up gyms with various techniques, and a lot of athletes consumed a lot of substances that they thought would help them reach their athletic goals. And so fast forward to what we call modern day sport. Around the 1800s, turn of the 1900s, we get this push as sport begins to become commodified and there's more economic stakes and it becomes competitive. We get this push to improve our performance. However, our scientific ideas behind athleticism were flawed at this time. Specifically, following the idea of social Darwinism and the practice of eugenics, people thought that those who were athletic were just talented people, that they were just born athletic. And sport was one of these things that allowed us to find out who was naturally athletic and who wasn't. And people thought that that athleticism was directly inherited from parents who possessed, say, the trait for athleticism. That you were either athletic or you weren't. Now, this doesn't seem too far off from how we understand athleticism today. However, they viewed athleticism as something that was fixed. We bring back the first law of thermodynamics that we brought up when we were talking about energy with menstruation, but this idea that total energy within a closed system is constant and it cannot be created and destroyed. This is how people viewed athleticism. They thought that all bodies had a fixed capacity of athleticism, that when you were a baby, you had this fixed, innate reserve of athleticism that throughout your life you may tap into, but it couldn't be improved. Whatever you had was what you had. And everybody then had an athletic ceiling. And so the role of science then, and the role of people interested in athletic development, was not to improve athleticism, since it was something that you either had or you didn't, or you had a lot of or you had little of, but it was to unleash the athleticism that you were already thought to have. And so the big focus was on refining technique, specifically for those who were deemed to be athletic. And the way to unleash your athletic potential, as Houle talks about in his early book on human performance, was basically just to live healthy, people thought. He said that the rules for athletic preparation differ but slightly from those of judicious living. The techniques that were used for acquiring general health in this instance were the same for trying to unleash your athletic potential. And as we know, with this thinking, a lot of coaches and athletes, and certainly scientists, didn't know that athleticism wasn't something that was capped. They didn't know that through certain training and targeted workouts and things like that, that you could actually improve your athleticism, that you could improve how high you jumped through doing leg workouts and calf workouts and actually practicing it, or that you could become stronger through working out. They saw soreness and overexertion of muscles as a bad thing, a thing that detracted from your athleticism for the next time, rather than, as we understand it today, something that will build it up to be stronger for the next time. And the basic principles of training that we know now weren't developed until after World War II. And within this thinking, a lot of substances for performance enhancements were commonplace during this time. And of course, some athletes died from it, based upon what we know now about it, but they weren't banned because they weren't seen as cheating. They weren't seen as giving an advantage and creating more athleticism in an unfair way. Rather, they were just seen as something that would allow athletes to use their already existing athleticism to the fullest. So if the thinking was, let's use the analogy of a car. If a car has a maximum speed of 50 miles per hour that it was born with, to use the analogy, then all performance enhancement drugs would do would allow it to perform at 50% for maybe 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes, or get it to 50 miles per hour faster than it normally would. But it wouldn't allow you to increase the speed to 60 miles per hour or something like that. So it wasn't seen as cheating. It was seen as a way to just more efficiently use the athleticism that you already had. However, a lot of studies starting in the 1920s, one of them being the Harvard Fatigue Lab, started to question this idea of a fixed human athletic capacity. And what the Harvard Fatigue Lab did, which wasn't so much interested in unlocking human potential as it was creating more efficient physical workers, but nonetheless, they did a bunch of studies on how bodies can perform in different environments with different activities, with different techniques, and they found that people can become better, so to speak, athletes or better physical performers depending upon their environment, their method, their technique, and the things that they're exposed to. In other words, they found that the engine can be improved from 50 miles per hour to 60 miles per hour. And this was kind of the turning point and the foundation of what we call exercise physiology today. And it was the discovery that there are certain things, whether that's natural or societal, that can be done to improve human performance, that it doesn't have a ceiling that's determinant of your birth. Despite this, though, it took a while to catch on. A lot of, specifically in sport, as a lot of athletes and coaches relied on tradition, relied on what they thought worked, and were slow to realize that athletic potential could be improved. However, it changed more so due to the Cold War and kind of the geopolitical circumstances post-World War II. And not only sport, as more money and TV contracts were heightening the stakes of each competition, but also there were some more national implications to it as well. So we're going to take a quick detour to talk about the Cold War real quick as context for why human performance took this leap into becoming something that scientists looked into more. So as we know about the Cold War, afterwards the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as these two superpowers and were engaged in not necessarily a war, but a series of attempting to diplomatically, militarily, whatever, spread capitalism or communism to other parts of the world, respectively. And they did this through political, military, economic, scientific, and propagandic means. And one of the means that we're calling propagandic here was not only sport, but kind of the physical stature of the nation. And as we know about the Cold War, there was this big competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. It existed in science where we were afraid of the science gap between us. So we had this space race and basically this big contest to see who could go into space first and put up a satellite and go to the moon. And whoever did that first was seen as indicative of the better economic system. We also had the missile gap, which was another contest to see who could develop nuclear bombs first, right? And that would be seen as a triumph of capitalism or communism, that they could go to the third world countries that they were trying to acquire or turn into their ideal system and say, look at us, we have the more superior science, we have the more superior military technology, you should be capitalist or you should be communist. And as we've discussed prior in the course, sport was another one of these contests that would be used to signal superiority and be used as a contest among the two nations within the context of the Cold War. It was something that in the Olympics or in whatever, whoever won was seen as indicative of that economic system that they were trying to establish as the ideal system in the world. So this was especially important because the athletes were kind of reflections of these economic systems. So a lot of communist countries funded their athletes through the state and had special sporting academies and supported them with state funds, which was indicative of their economic system. Whereas in the United States, a lot of athletes were funded privately through organizations or whatever, but not through the government, indicative of capitalist privatism. So whoever won in any battle in the Olympics, they could point to capitalism and say, look, privatism won, capitalism is obviously the best, whereas if Russia or the Soviet Union won, they could just say, look, communist funding created this superior athlete, obviously communism is the way to go. So those were kind of the politics of sport at that time. Nonetheless, it wasn't just sport, but kind of the physicality of the United States that was fueled by this Cold War anxiety. So after we fought the Korean War in the 1950s, which was kind of a subsidy of the Cold War, there was this panic over, once again, that our men specifically are not manly enough and that they're not fit enough. And they didn't, a third of the draftees were declared unfit, basically didn't meet the arbitrary standard that we said men needed to be in order to fight a war should one pop off. And so in response to this, we get this craze around health and fitness and sport. Not just because people like health and fitness and sport so much, but because it's seen as something that's essential to defending our nation and maintaining it and keeping our national goals intact. And there's this idea that beyond the missile gap and the science gap, there was this muscle gap, that Soviet men were stronger than our men, and that if a war were to occur, we would be unable to defend ourselves. So in response to this muscle gap, which I should say was pretty much made up and was spread through a lot of propaganda and misunderstanding and just all the stupid stuff that was going on in the Cold War era, President Eisenhower and later JFK implemented a series of measures to try to get our men to be stronger, to increase their physical performance. And they initiated the President's Council of Youth Fitness, used media and celebrities to try to disseminate these messages about how to be fit and what was the ideal standard, co-opted the PE classes and put through elementary school and high schools all these arbitrary tests. I know you guys remember the presidential fitness, and I know y'all remember the beeper test, or the pacer test as it's called. That's a product of this era and these anxieties over not matching these military standards. But nonetheless, for our purposes, they turned to science to try to innovate human performance. And as Hoberman says, the entire enterprise of elite sport is best understood as a recent chapter in the history of applied medical research into human biological development. So in the context of the Cold War, in addition to sport becoming this big business that at this time is $1 million industry and soon would be $1 billion industry, we see why the stakes are so high to try to increase human performance. And what we get is this increasing what we call medicalization of life, where a lot of these conditions were identified as being the reason that people were not up to the standard or people were not reaching their athletic potential. And we have kind of for the first time an era in which we turn to the medical institution to try to identify the ways that we can right these wrongs about our body in order to, for some people, just be healthy, but for other people, increase their performance and improve their potential. And so we get, as we talked about before, menstruation, which was seen as this flaw that was not allowing women to be athletic. We get the rise of the industry of gynecology. We get aging, which is seen as something that's bad. We get gerontology derived from this era, where we turn to the medical system as a way to try to alleviate these things that were considered to be flaws, whether or not they actually were. And because of this, as the Waddington article talks about, we get these disciplines pop up: exercise phys, biomechanics, sports psychology, that makes athletes increasingly dependent upon a whole group of specialist advisors in their training and development. So in some ways, this is a good thing, right? I mean, as we talked about in the last lecture, it's better than the coach just screaming at you and telling you to be tougher while depriving you of water. It's better that people with actual expertise are helping you in certain areas. But on the other hand, we get the rise of this hyper-structured and this hyper-dependent life for athletes in which they have to be reliant on all these external advisors, not only doctors and trainers, but nutritionists, psychologists, chiropractors, even pastors, right? And these are all derivations of the medicalization of sport, where if you talk to athletes today, they'll tell you, even the collegiate athletes, that it's not just you go to practice and then you go home and rest and play your game whenever you play it. It's that you wake up early in the morning and go through your workout that's led by your trainer, and then you go see the nutritionist to see what you're going to eat for that day, and then you go to practice or something, and then if your mental state is seen to be off, you will go see a psychologist, and then so point being that there's all these external advisors that take away kind of the agency, right? There's the physiologist, your biomechanist, your psychologist, nutritionist, physiotherapist, trainers. And they're important because they do help in some areas. The belief is that they provide a boost to performance, right? Whether that's real or imagined, and then that boost will provide economic value for the team, right? I put pastors because it's also seen as spiritual life is off, and that's why we need pastors, not because they really care, coaches and teams really care about the spiritual life of their athletes, but it's seen as a way to increase their performance or make them more mentally solvent or whatever, I don't know. But we get the rise of this medicalization, and it's something that's ubiquitous in sports today. As we know, Chip Kelly, when he was an old football coach, he had heart rate monitors on his players at every practice. He would test their urine to measure hydration. The Capitals, their nutritionist looks at blood, and they give vitamins and recommend food to players based on these things that they identify about their performance. In the NBA, coaches and trainers will put GPS trackers on players just to kind of see how much they're walking and how much they're doing these physically active things, and so on and so on. And it arises a lot of questions about the agency of athletes. Nonetheless, it's commonplace now because it's seen to increase performance. And as the Epstein video talked about at the beginning of this lecture, we have seen significant performance. Like I said, with the commercialization of sport, where there's more money involved, athletes have more incentives and resources to train year-round and apply these new scientific knowledges to their lifestyle. Sport becomes something that isn't just this hobby that after work you play your sport. It becomes something that is a lifestyle that you need to train year-round for, every day, every meal, etc. And we see, because of this significant breakthroughs in human performance, we get Roger Bannister for the first time run a 4-minute mile in 1954, which was something that at one point was seen as impossible. But he did this because he had degrees in physiology and medicine and applied a lot of his scientific knowledge to his training regime. And so we talked about the pseudoscience of race earlier, and this kind of manic attempt to figure out if and why black athletes are more athletic than white athletes. And of course, they didn't find anything that was attributable to race, but it did find that some people in general are better suited for particular athletic activities. Of course, anyone could get better at anything through training and discipline and things like that. But certain body types did have certain athletic advantages. It wasn't based on race, but it was based on body type. For example, tall people are going to be better at basketball, or at least have a higher potential to be better at basketball. Not because they're tall, but because the game of basketball favors tallness. Now, as I'm sure you all know, a lot of tall people are not good at basketball, and a lot of short people are. But we know that it's easier, if you're tall, to be better at basketball. Same thing with gymnasts that favors smaller, more petite bodies, that they have a higher power to size ratio. With swimmers, swimming favors shorter legs and long torsos, whereas running favors longer legs and shorter torsos. And so this is kind of helps develop our understanding of the potential of human bodies for athleticism. So that's kind of the biological look at it, but also we take into account the context of improving techniques and materials and surfaces and overall technology that allows people to perform better than they have in the past. We get better tracks, we get better shoes, we overall get more materials that allow people in their sport to become better at it.
Take a look at the record for the 100-meter freestyle swim. The record is always trending downward, but it's punctuated by these steep cliffs. This first cliff in 1956 is the introduction of the flip turn. Rather than stopping and turning around, athletes could somersault under the water and get going right away in the opposite direction. This second cliff, the introduction of gutters on the side of the pool that allows water to splash off, rather than becoming turbulence that impedes the swimmers as they race. This final cliff, the introduction of full body and low friction swimsuits. Throughout sports, technology has changed the face of performance.
But now for the final part of this lecture, let's look at the implications of this progress. Because with this increased athletic potential, there often, or usually, comes considerable risks, such as players willing to sacrifice their long-term health for short-term success and economic gain, coaches pressuring their players and doctors to return to the field, trainers handing out these pain substances and amphetamines to get players on the field, players, coaches, doctors using players as guinea pigs for performance-enhancing drugs. And point being, all these different things that we could list off, that it creates ethical dilemmas, specifically for people involved in this medicalization of sport. And so, as we asked in the last lecture, and we need to ask again in this context, to whom is the sporting medical professional responsible to? Are you responsible to the team, which has your paycheck, or the player in which they are your patient? Or do you recommend surgery that gets a player on the field sooner versus one that has a longer recovery time but is ultimately better for the player? It creates a lot of these ethical dilemmas. If the player themselves say that they are fine, and the coach, of course, says that they are fine, but you know for a fact in your expertise that they're not, and you know it won't be your fault, do you save the player from themselves? It creates a lot of these questions given this progress. And one of the big questions that has arisen through this is what we now call illegal performance enhancement. So this was something that, in the context of the Cold War, as we talked about in the muscle gap, became kind of a significant issue. A lot of the Russians would take straight testosterone, and the U.S. physician John Ziegler developed anabolic steroids that were pretty commonplace at this time. There wasn't really a taboo on them still. And by the 60s, steroid use was rampant. In the United States, coaches and athletes would take performance enhancement to help themselves, or the private people funding them would, whereas in the Soviet Union, the state-sponsored programs that educated and trained the athletes would encourage them to take it or give it to them without their knowledge. Regardless, it was seen as something that was just harmlessly helping them do better. It wasn't really a conversation yet around the long-term implications of it. And so in 1967, they get banned under the pretense that they are cheating, essentially, that they give an artificial or unfair increase in performance and competition. It wasn't so much for the long-term health of the athlete, but it was for the integrity of the game. But despite this rule, the IOC couldn't test for them effectively until 1967, and still, or 76, I'm sorry, and still people would get around it. An effective test for doping didn't come until 2004. Nonetheless, even with these tests in other sports, PED use was commonplace, kind of an open secret. By the 1960s, football players were given them all the time, and it was something that helped them get in shape and stay stronger and kind of allow them to withstand some of the physical punishment that they get in the game of football. In baseball, though, a lot of people resisted taking steroids because, as we know, kind of these big, bulky muscles are not favorable in baseball because they don't help the motion. They would reduce speed and flexibility. And it's kind of odd that whenever we kind of talk about PEDs and steroids, it's usually in the context of baseball, in which PEDs probably give athletes the least advantage in comparison to football or hockey or a more physical sport that relies on brute strength. Nonetheless, a lot of baseball players would take it because they told themselves that it gave them the energy to complete this long 162 game schedule. And in other sports, it was kind of where people turned a cold shoulder. But nonetheless, it existed. And it had significant impact. This is a former NFL player named Lyle Alzado, and he was a really good defensive lineman in the 70s and 80s. He played for 15 seasons, was a 3-time Pro Bowler, and after he retired, he admitted that he regularly used steroids starting in 1971 for the next 20 years in order to build up his body and increase aggression. And ultimately, he got brain cancer at 43 years old, and he directly blamed the steroids for it. And so it wasn't clear that the steroids were the direct link that killed him, although he was convinced of it. But what we know now is that steroids do harbor many dangerous short-term and long-term physical and mental health issues. So in conclusion, we get this human progress in that, well, some people tend to think that it's just humans are developing and becoming more physical specimens. Really, we know that the societal answer is a little bit more convincing, in that there's better technology now, better training methods, specialization that you can target muscles to build them up, better chemical enhancement. And despite this progress and this increased human performance, we need to understand the various costs and the various risks that come with them, especially as people within kinesiology. And specifically, we need to consider a lot of the moral, ethical, and medical implications of our actions as we try to balance the increased athletic performance of athletes with their health, their body, and their minds. Thank you.